So this is a GNC recording. That's the General Naturopathic Council. And we're delighted to have Peter Jackson-Main with us today. He's actually the president of the GNC and has been its chair since 2018. After graduating from Cambridge University in the 1970s, Peter committed himself to a lifelong path of investigating and training in natural medicine through many modalities, but eventually specializing in herbal medicine, iridology, and naturopathy. He represented the herbal and naturopathic professions at government level in two major national consultations on herbal medicine and was instrumental in founding the Association of Master Herbalists, a professional body that represents naturopathic herbal practitioners. In 2003, he began to teach for the College of Naturopathic Medicine, CNM, eventually becoming course director for the Herbal Medicine Pathway, director of research, and its overall academic director, posts which he occupies to the present day. He's the author of Practical Iridology, Use Your Eyes to Pinpoint Your Health Risks and Your Particular Path to Well-Being, republished in a revised expanded edition by Eon Books in 2023, and has been a contributor to several books on herbal and naturopathic medicine over the years. What we're going to talk about today is his new publication, his second book on iridology, which has just been published this year, and it's called The Mind's Eye, Personality and Behavior as Revealed in Quantum Iris Analysis. So we very much look forward to this. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Gillian.
Well, why don't you go ahead, Peter, and first of all, let us know a little bit about why you felt that this particular book was needed.
Sure. I think I felt this way for a long time because I feel that um, as a teacher, an educator in iridology, um, I was conscious that I used to run my own course before I started teaching for CNM. Now I run all undergraduate training at CNM, but prior to that, I had my own iridology course. And at one point, or pretty much from its inception, actually, we were teaching what I call the non-physical aspects of iridology. That's those applications and approaches that had more to do with personality, behavior, psychology, emotion, etc. We were teaching that as a routine part of the course, but I found myself competing with shorter and cheaper courses who were only doing the classical medical physiological stuff. And so reluctantly, in order to stay in the marketplace, I stopped teaching the non-physical aspects and began to just go with a shorter course that competed with everybody else. And then from time to time would offer the non-physical aspects as a sort of postgraduate add-on, if you like. But I ended up not teaching them as much as I would like to. Teaching iridology within the context of naturopathy, it wasn't really needed either, although there is an argument for saying that since it's part of the naturopathic philosophy that we address the mind, the body, and the soul. So clearly there is a kind of a rationale for going into those areas. But I was always intrigued by that. I mean, from the very first day in iridology, when I was being taught by a guy called Harry Wolf from the USA, and he was sort of flitting really between talking about the liver and then talking about anger and resentment, or talking about the kidneys and talking about fear. And I began to realize that there was a sort of element of energetics here, really, which resonated very well with things like, well, traditional Chinese medicine, and also the humoral tradition, which is at the bottom of what we do in the West, in Western herbal medicine, the Hippocratic tradition. And so I was always motivated to try to incorporate that not only into what I was doing as an iridologist, but also that understanding into the way I taught it as well. So I've had in mind to write a book about this approach for many, many years now. And I started writing it in 2018, and we all know what happened next. So nothing happened, everything was interrupted. And I didn't really get back onto it until about 2022, when randomly I approached Aon and said, well, first of all, I approached Aon because I wanted to know whether they would like to take on practical iridology as a reprint, which they snapped up. And then I said, on the back of the email, I said, oh, by the way, I do have a few other books you might be interested in. And this was one of them. And I sent them 3 chapters that I had already finished. And again, there was no hesitation. They snapped it up. But then I think that, in writing it, it became something different as well. But maybe we'll get into that.
Wow, thank you very much. Just to sort of hold it up and show everyone the wonderful book. My blur is on, so it's not showing very well. Let me just take the blur out.
There
There
we
we
go.
are. Very, very thick book as well. There's lots and lots in it. Who would you say it's directed towards? I mean, could a member of, a layperson read it, or is it really
Yeah.
only for your students?
No, it's not for my students really. It isn't really for my students, to be perfectly honest. I mean, they're welcome to buy it, of course. It's directed in 2 directions, I think. One, yes, very much towards lay people to try to expand the idea. Iridology out there is not really very well known. Actually, I mean, about half the people I meet have never heard of it, and those who do have heard of it don't really know what it's about. So it is to illuminate iridology and another aspect of iridology, which people may not be so aware about. But it's also, I think, I regard it as my contribution to the profession, because I do feel I'm writing also for my colleagues, many of whom have got, and my teachers, many of whom feature in the book in terms of references that I've made and my own journey through iridology and the people I learned from. And I was fortunate in a way because many people who studied classical iridology really started with Jensen or Deck. And very, very rarely did they sort of go into any other territory. When Denny Ray Johnson came along and published his book in, I think, am I right in saying it was 1995, Andrew? I can't quite.
Probably just because there's a part one and there's a part two. So I think part two, yeah, about 95, 96, but part
Yeah.
one could be as early as sort of 81,
Well,
82.
I know that part one was available. I know that Harry was aware of part one when he was teaching us, and I guess it was down to Harry Wolf really that I was introduced to these. Well, he used to call them applications, which I really like, and I've made something of this in the book actually. If you regard the iris itself as the hardware, and the application as the software, so to speak, and what you read in the iris is very much to do with the application that you use. So we have the application of classical iridology, which is the one that most people know, which is about the organ positions and the constitutional types and the way that we read a person's health patterns in the iris. And then there are other applications. There are a number of other applications actually. One of the people who came forward very strongly in this latest book was the Italian iridologist Daniele Lorito, and he's invented at least a dozen different applications for iridology, amongst which time risk, which I briefly discuss in the book, something called space risk, which is very much about the nervous system, the central nervous system through the spine, and there are astrological applications, believe it or not, as well, and there's behavioral iridology and Rayid, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to sort of get away from the classical iridology mainly because I've been involved in experiences where people have had a very negative um, take on iridology. I mean, I remember there was one of the Mind Body Soul festivals that I was at. I think it was in the east of England somewhere, and somebody walked past my stand where I was giving taster sessions in iridology and sort of gave me the sign of the cross and said, don't bring that stuff anywhere near me. And I said, well, what's the matter? Why are you doing this? Why are you saying that? And said, well, I've just had a reading with that person over there, and I can tell you that it's evil stuff. I feel horrible. I feel absolutely dreadful having gone through this. And I said, after I talked to her for a bit about it, I realized that she was basically the experience that she had was something that I'm always warning my students against, which is giving people a negative and scary experience. Actually, my view is that if you want to give someone a really negative diagnosis, leave it to the doctors. It's not the sort of stuff that we should be doing. And so I thought that in many cases, however, iridology was disadvantaged in the classical mold from the start by the fact that it resolutely used what I can only describe as the language of pathology. So this is language that emphasizes illness and sickness and symptoms rather than anything else. If you hear Larito talk, and there's a really interesting video of Larito talking in those people that you hooked up with, Andrew, what are they called? Worldwide Iridology or
Oh,
something?
yeah, iridology around the world. Yeah.
Iridology around the world, where he very clearly says this sign that we call, say, for the sake of argument, a stair-step lacuna, looked at a different way, can become a sign that points up something that the individual needs to know or expand into in their lives in order to grow as a person. Yeah. And so I decided that in this book, particularly, I wanted to get away from pathologizing everything. And I wanted to focus on what iridology could do if we regarded it as a roadmap, if you like, for things that we might need to know about during the course of our lives, things that we might need to learn as individuals. My personal take, and I go through this in the philosophy section, chapter 1, where I sort of lay the ground rules, if you like, for what we're doing. And I say, basically, it's an article of faith for me. You may not believe it. I don't know. It's up to everyone. This is ontology, the science of existence or the study of existence. And we all have different takes on it. But for me, we come here for a reason. We're not just randomly evolving clumps of cells that, the sort of, we're not what Richard Dawkins would like to believe we are before he had his illumination. We're actually purposeful beings. We have a program. We have a set of we have a curriculum, if you like, that we've set for ourselves. And I think it can help to have some guidance on that curriculum. And I think for me, the iris functions extremely well in that regard. So that was the approach I took to it.
I should say that I actually did Peter's course way back in when he was still teaching that module, and I was very glad that he did. It was a nice addition to the work. To see, obviously the physical is fascinating, but I just like that sort of extra leap into the kind of behavioral interpretation at the end. And I think it was really nice to have that module and that early exposure to it, because you kind of introduced a lot of stuff to me I'd never heard of. I mean, I was working with Raid at that time, but I wasn't aware of any of the other stuff. So that was a nice addition, and glad that that's sort of migrated into your book as well.
Yes, and Andrew Mason, you've written your own book, haven't you, called Behavioral Iridology?
Just purely by fluke, they came out at the same time.
Yes,
That's just the way the wafer crumbles.
Well, I don't know whether it's fluke. I regard it as a rather happy coincidence, actually, because I mean, Andrew and I've, as Andrew says, he first studied iridology with in my private course back in, I think we decided it was 2002, didn't we?
2002, yeah.
And we've been, we've been talking to each other ever since. Actually, I mean, Andrew's also done a lot of the graphics for my book, and he did the graphics on my map. And we've, I think when you began to write behavioral iridology, we had a number of conversations back and forth about various aspects. So we've always kind of, I feel that the two projects they're kind of sister projects in a way, because they sort of grew up together and in tangent with each other.
Yeah, that's just good to have that resource. I like that you've covered a lot of topics in that book. I mean, it's a pretty concise work. I mean, you've given the groundwork it's a good explanation of the RAID system. You've got Larito's work, then you've got your own work in there as well. Lots of case histories, which are great. And then the best bit is, for me, is the way you've kind of looked at the physical map overlaid on the emotional map, and then onto the iris as well. So you're sort of getting two for the price of one.
Yeah, that was a sort of stroke of genius. And I've had people sort of saying to me, wow, that's an amazing graphic. Who did that for you? And I said, well, actually, I did it myself. I just used a sort of magnifying glass widget that is embedded in somewhere in my computer. And it was very easy to do. I did struggle with it a little bit. It was a bit slippery, but I managed to do it, and I'm very pleased with the results. But I've always felt that that idea of matching organs with energetically with emotions, etc., was a really important part of the way we work as humoral physicians. Naturopathically, we're not just treating the body; we are treating the full system, the body, mind, spirit, or whatever you want to call it. And therefore, it's possible to make connections between emotions and feelings and thoughts, even, and the physical organs. Now, we know this goes back to traditional Chinese medicine, and probably other energetic systems as well. So why not try to reinforce those connections in the context of an iridology map, if you like? And I think that I've been doing that for some time actually, and I think that I guess about 20 years ago now, I became aware of something called PNEI, which stands for Psychoneuroendocrinoimmunology. It was originally PNI, Psychoneuroimmunology, and a vast body of literature that was starting to accumulate around that title, kicked off, I think, in the first place by Candice Pert's Molecules of Emotion, where it suddenly became obvious in a hardcore scientific context that there was a considerable amount of two-way traffic between an emotion or a feeling or a thought or a belief and a physical symptom or a physical organ. And I say two-way traffic because it goes both ways. It's like the thoughts will influence the body and the body will influence the thoughts backwards, if you like. And we see this, for example, I mean, I have a very funny story that I tell about somebody who is doing a liver detox. And he was a regular client, and I put him on the liver detox for very good reasons, as I always do, usually. And he one day, at the time, I had a shop on the high street in Cambridge, and he came storming into the shop, banged his fists on the counter, and said, "I'm angry, and it's your fault." And I sort of said, I calmed him down, said, right, come into the back room. Better not to do this in front of the customers. And we went into the back room and he said, yeah, ever since I've been doing this liver flush, this anger has just been bubbling up out of me like it's volcanic. And I thought, well, that's a very, very good demonstration, in fact, of how if we repress certain feelings and certain emotions, they can damage organs and they can sort of act as a kind of reservoir. I think of what in energetic medicine we might call stagnation or heat or perverse heat, even. We've heard of liver heat rising and even liver fire blazing, are descriptions that come to us via traditional Chinese medicine. And I've always been very interested in what we used to call the mind-body connection. One of the first papers I ever wrote in a naturopathic context was something which I wrote for the Polarity Therapy Association many, many moons ago, back in the 1990s, I think, about energy and mind and how that sort of, the energy sort of somehow, arrives at a physical manifestation in the body, but actually is composed of nothing but energy. Everything is energy, and this is a core, a foundational principle in the book that I've written, is that understanding that it's all energy, and if you do understand that it's all energy, it kind of becomes easier to shift. If you see a symptom as something resolutely stuck, and the definition of stagnation, I always think, is not just that you've got something accumulating in the tissues or in an organ of the body, but you also think about it in a stagnant way. You think, I have got this, and you call it a name, and you make it a definite thing, a pathology, an entity, all in its own right. And then it takes on a life, it takes on a reality that maybe it doesn't need to have if you can start thinking about how you might move that energy. So the book really, I guess, is also a guide to how we might think about ourselves in those terms and how we might start to employ some very simple understandings. It's not even their techniques. I'm not a psychotherapist, by the way. I'm so far away from that. It's nothing to do with psychotherapy at all. It's simply about understanding ourselves and understanding where the energetic currents in our bodies and our lives and our emotions, where they can take us and what they're all about.
I think also, Peter, thank you. I received the book as well. Thank you for that. But also, you mentioned something about resonance as a core human emotion. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit about that? What you mean by this in and its role in iris counseling?
Yes, this is very important. and it kind of, I say I'm not a psychotherapist. In the interests of full disclosure, I should say, I used to be a psychotherapist. I gave it up because I found it very circular and very unfulfilling. People would know exactly why they were angry, but they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. They'd still be angry. I know why I'm angry, but I'm still angry. Um, so, in the course of that work, I came across a guy called Carl Rogers. Some of you will know about Carl Rogers. And he was probably the arch pioneer of human-centered psychotherapy or counseling or whatever. And whether or not we know it, all of us in what we like to call the alternative, the natural healing professions, owe something to Carl Rogers because he set the template for how we should how we should interview patients and how we should use ourselves and our bodies in that interaction. And he talked about something which is, I guess, it was really a description of empathy, which is understanding almost in a very physical way what a patient is going through. And that's partly what I mean by resonance. When you're with somebody and you're just doing a very ordinary job of taking a case history, which we all do, and if you're really tuning into them, there are some sort of quite subjective concepts here for which I apologize. But I do feel that they're kind of generally understood by people. If you're tuning into somebody and you're focusing upon them, then at a certain point, you do get a very almost physical sensation of what it is that they're going through. And that's a very important guidance, I think, for us as we're making therapeutic decisions, for example. So for me, a therapeutic decision is not simply a set of intellectual operations or calculations. It's something that has a much sort of, I think there was a guy called Eugene Gendlin who invented something called focusing, which became quite big in the sort of what we call the humanistic psychology movement. And he talked about the felt sense of something. And the felt sense is something you almost can't put into words. But when it happens, there's a connection, there's a rightness about about that interaction. So that resonance for me is something I always look for when I'm um, seeing clients, patients, whatever you want to call them, to guide me as to whether I'm really understanding what they're all about and the situation that they're in. And of course, I have called one of the we might get on to talking about my 9 domains. I had terrible trouble figuring out what to call them all and whether to call them domains or principles or whatever. But I ended up with domains because I felt that there was a domain is like an encircling of a core principle or set of core principles, and one of them is actually called and they partition the iris in 8 radial sectors and a central sector, and one of them is actually called resonance. And the reason it's called that is because it's actually, if you look at the map, it's all about the nose. And it's also having a nose for something, if you like. There's a resonance there with words as well, but also because the sinus cavities, which are also in the same location, are those apertures or openings or cavities within the structure of our face, which give our voices their resonance. If you've got blocked sinuses, you can hear it in the way somebody talks. And if you've got a clear resonance, it changes the quality of the voice. And I'm very, very keen, actually, that people should start paying attention to the voice, especially practitioners when they're talking to patients, because I think the quality of the voice is really, really important. I mean, I've had people say to me, a long, long time ago, I was working up in the north of England in a very, very busy naturopathic herbal clinic. And I was seeing sort of between 20 and 40 patients in a day, which shows you how busy it was. I was like a GP. It was extraordinary, extraordinary learning situation as well. But one point I found myself getting interested in the fact that the therapeutic success, the clinical success of that practice was astronomical. It was so heartwarmingly successful. People would just get better. I had encountered people getting better, but it usually took a lot longer. and there was a lot more sort of struggle and kind of deliberation involved, and people would just come and they would get better. And I said to a few of them, I said, it strikes me that down in the south, down in London, if I do an initial consultation with you, I'm going to give you an hour. Some people give more than that. Some people give an hour and a half. I give an hour. Um, it's partly to do with people's attention spans. I don't think they can take much more than that. But up in the north, it was like I do initial consultations. The maximum would be 20 minutes, and it was more often 15, and follow-ups would be 5 or 10. And I said to somebody once, I said, I would do a much longer session down in London, but here, because I've got so many people who want to see me, this was a very, very well established practice that I took over from a very famous herbalist. We can only give you 10 or 15 minutes. How do you feel about that? And I had 2 or 3 people say, well, actually, it just seems the time just doesn't seem to be an issue. I feel as though I sat down with you for 10 minutes. I feel as though it's more like half an hour, and I could listen to your voice forever. And he said, there's something about your voice that that reassures, comforts, inspires. I'm not boasting here, by the way. I didn't know this at all about myself, but I found myself doing it. And they said it's almost like the time doesn't matter because the quality of attention is so powerful, and it's partly to do with what I was doing with my voice, apparently.
Fantastic.
Yes,
Maybe,
that was my second question about the nine energy.
yes, I was going to ask about
Yeah,
those as
nine
well. Tell
energetic
us more.
domains. Yeah, so you managed to answer that as well. And two answers, one question, two
We
answers.
could go into a lot more detail about that one if you want. I mean, I'm aware it's.
Yeah, if you could maybe give a brief description of this overview of this framework, basically, and how it helps to interpreting iris signs. That was my question. So,
Yeah, well, I think what I noticed from the earliest days really was that there were groupings within the iris chart. For those watching who may not know this, I'm wondering whether anybody's got one that they could just briefly flash up. I don't know whether you have.
Yeah, I
If
could
you could
probably
arrange a
share.
share, Shahid, if you could arrange for people to share.
you
You
mean
you've got the one in the book,
yeah,
but it would be nice if we could actually share one.
yeah.
And if we share the map, the latest version of my map, maybe,
Yeah.
it struck me that there were groupings within the organs in the sectors, the radial sectors of the iris. And then, of course, the iris is arranged on the map with a central section, which goes around the pupil, which is variously called the pupillary zone, the nutritive zone, which gives you a clue as to what it's all about in classical iridology, or the collarette. And then there's a structure called the border of the collarette, which is to a greater or lesser extent visible in the iris, which is a thin demarcating line, not a circular line by any means. At least it very, very rarely is completely circular. Lots of ins and outs, jagged, spikes and indentations and everything. And this is a structure we call the border of the collarette, and it registers a lot of information for us. But the groupings, like if you take the digestive organs, for example, and you can see, here we go. This is the map that goes with the 9 energetic domains. So we've got in the middle there we've got nourishment, which is the stomach ring in classical iridology, and also the intestines. It's in a graphic, it's circular, but it rarely is circular in the actual iris. Around that, we've got a very interesting zone called the humoral zone, which is otherwise described as a zone of transportation and distribution. It pretty much maps very closely to what the TCM people refer to in the concept of spleen. And it in fact contains organs that are associated with digestion, like the pancreas, for example. And it contains the hormonal organs like the pituitary gland up at 12 o'clock or 0, and then at 6 o'clock the adrenal glands. And so all of these organs are sort of grouped around this the central ring. But then if we take the domains here, we've got creativity at the bottom, we've got assertion and self-reliance in the lower diagonal sectors, and then we've got exchange and authenticity coming up in the what I call the sort of lateral or horizontal axis. And if you look on the physical map, and it was actually the physical map that I hoped Andrew was going to put up there, actually.
Oh, sorry, I can.
It's okay. It's fine. If we can just swap that over, and I can just talk about that a little bit. If you go, for example, if you remember where creativity was at the bottom there, and then when we get the physical map up, we'll have a look at what appears there in terms of physical organs.
Just talk amongst yourself for a second. I got to
So,
think because it's not immediately an
it's
accessible.
okay. I think you did very well to get that one up, and I'm quite glad you did. But so in the kidney sector, now we call it kidney because the major organ that appears at the bottom of the iris, in that wedge at the bottom, is the kidney. One in each iris, of course, because you've got two of them.
There you
Okay,
go.
there we go. Right. It's a bit washed out, but I think we can see what we need to see. The kidney is here. Right the way through the kidney is the leg. And then around that, we've got the uterus, the sexual organs, prostate is in the pink blob there, the fallopian tubes, and the ovary and testes. And that forms the bulk of that sort of bottom slice, that bottom radial slice that I've called creativity. And I called it creativity really because of the inclusion of the reproductive organs, because the reproduction is the creativity of the species. Okay. And again, in traditional Chinese medicine, the concept of kidney, organs in Chinese medicine are not restricted to the physical organs that we know, like the kidney is a filtering organ. The kidney in Chinese medicine is the seat of vitality, and it has a whole other reality. And I think personally that translates much better onto the iris map that we've got than thinking about kidney just in terms of a filtering organ. Because I pointed out many times, the kidney is down here with the leg. Well, actually, the kidneys are in the middle of the back. So how do we rationalize that in terms of the way that pretty much every single iridology map is arranged? But if you think about the kidney being the principle of the kidney, the seat of vitality, that also governs the reproductive function, then it makes perfect sense that the kidney is bang in the middle of that whole sector, which is the pelvis, the reproductive organs, etc., and so forth. And and there are other groupings as well. So the heart and the lungs, for example, over at sort of 3 o'clock in the 3 o'clock wedge in the left iris, and also the 9 o'clock wedge in the right iris. I've got a cursor here, but I realize you can't see it because I'm not actually sharing this.
If I do that, does it? Can you
Yeah,
see?
yeah. If you just go, yeah, that's right. So the 3 o'clock sector, we have the orange blobs, which are the heart, the yellow area, which is the lungs, got the breast in the middle of that as well, and the same thing on the other side in the right iris. And to me, this is the domain of exchange, right? And there's two things about that. One is the lungs, because the lungs are literally gas exchange. And I point out to students when we're teaching this, that if we're all sitting in a room together learning iridology, and we're in that room for maybe a few hours, as we often are, then by the time we've gone out of that room at the end of the day, we probably recycled each other's breath quite a few times. In other words, what I breathe out, you will then breathe in, especially if I'm quite close to you. And this is an idea which I think a lot of people would sort of run a mile if they actually thought about it. But this is a very deep and very intimate kind of exchange, okay? And then we come to the heart, which is an organ, again, of sharing. It's a different kind of exchange, but it is exchange nonetheless. If you're in a heart-centered space, and by the way, I draw a direct sort of opposition, if you like, or counterbalance between the vertical axis, which runs through the heart and the lung, and also the other side, the thyroid. I'll come to that in a moment. And the horizontal axis, which runs through the heart and the thyroid and the throat area, and the vertical axis, which runs through the kidney, obviously, in the leg at the bottom there, but also if you go up to the top region, the brain. There's an area right at 0 o'clock or 12 at the top there that frequently in some maps has things like animation lifeline or vitality or something like that associated with it. Okay, but the vertical line is also the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in physiological terms. And there's another axis at play, which involves the heart, and I put the thyroid in there as well, and I've called it the heart voice thyroid vector. And I lectured about this to the guild many years ago, actually, and I brought the whole thing about the voice in. So some of these ideas go back that I think it was 2011, so near sort of 13, 14 years now. And it turns out when you look at the heart, particularly, what you realize is, if you study it properly, that the heart has an output of no less than 5 hormones. And if you examine what those hormones do, you find out that they are involved in activating the parasympathetic nerve system, which is exactly the opposite of the HPA, which activates the sympathetic nerve system. Okay, so there's a natural balancing or compensatory mechanism going on, whereby if you get too sympathetic charge, sympathetic dominant, something should kick in and just kind of restore the balance to the parasympathetic. And of course, many of us live in sympathetic dominance, 24/7 these days. So the poor old heart doesn't get much of a look in. Not really surprising then that cardiovascular disease is still the #1 killer in our society. But it's very interesting to note that the emotional and energetic charge of the horizontal axis, whereas if we could say the HPA, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, is all about stress. It's called the stress axis and our response to the challenges of life. And we need it, obviously. We need to be able to respond to the challenges of life. The heart thyroid, the horizontal vector, is more about communication and collaboration, company. I'm choosing a lot of C words here deliberately. So rather than being combat and competition and challenge, we've got sharing, community, collaboration, and that sort of thing going along those heart axes. So again, the notion of exchange comes in there. I'm just picking bits and pieces. I can't go through the whole system with you, obviously, here. I'm picking bits and pieces of resonances, if you like, which illustrate how I've worked the system. And I've talked for a long time, so somebody say something else.
I just wanted to ask very quickly about the on the map. You've made a big, obviously you separate the 9th domain as the nourishment area directly around the pupil. Now you've got a nice big red ring around that to indicate the zone of integration, but obviously that's falling in that kind of expression ring or ANW or whatever collarette. So is there anything specific to the collarette that you've kind of singled out in this? I mean, admittedly, I've read the book, but I did a skim read. I haven't done a deep dive into it yet. So there may be something in there that I've missed.
Can you get the other chart back up, Andrew? And I'll talk you through that one, because the work, interestingly, the work has developed since the publication of this book. And that happened because Daniele asked me to contribute to a new book that he has got coming out soon, which is a very specific topic of autoimmune pancreatitis. And he asked me, he said he put the picture of the irides of the person. It was a sort of the book is presented as a case study of one individual, an N of 1 case study. Okay. And he gave me the pictures and I got to work on them, and I applied this template. And what I realized was, if you think about the pancreas is seen in the iris at something like 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock in that central red ring that we can see up there. That's where it occurs, and it's called the humoral zone. Okay. Now, what came through in that was that I started to see that the humoral zone, as it does physically with nourishment, it's responsible for transporting the nourishment that is generated in the digestive lumen. outwards towards the rest of the system. And the same thing happens if you take nourishment in a kind of a more energetic or emotional or that kind of a subjective sense. It's about whether you're willing to nourish yourself, whether you're willing to be here, whether you have that sense of yourself as a physical being who deserves to be nourished. Because many of us don't. Many of us sort of are quite diffident about what we deserve, and we have low self-esteem, we have low self-regard, etc., and we may not, in fact. And one of the points that I've made with nourishment, of course, is that even though we all think that we eat okay, even those of us who are naturopathically minded, many of us still have evidence of a disturbed relationship with food. I'm putting my, or is it just me? I'm putting myself out there on a limb, but I've never met anybody. I do this in class. I say to people, okay, hands up, anyone who never knowingly puts something in their mouth that they know will hurt them. And nobody puts their hands up, except I think one person did once. And now there are problems here in terms of the fact that, especially I think when we come to nutritional theory, we can end up getting quite fastidious about what we eat, and I don't think that's helpful either. It's perhaps more healthy to have a more flexible approach to eating, because as we all know, if digestive power be sufficient to purposes, even bad food can nourish us, and if digestive power be insufficient to purposes, even good food can turn toxic inside of us, right? So it's all about the conversion itself. But it's also about the ideas. There's a story which I tell in the book, which is of a guy who goes into his doctor and he says, doctor, typical intro, my stomach's bothering me. And the doctor looks at him quizzically and says, are you sure you're not bothering your stomach? And at that point, you start to think, okay, this food upsets me. My gran used to say it, I like cheese, but it doesn't like me. This food upsets me. This food is toxic, or it has the wrong lectins in it, or whatever. But if you reinforce that idea, suddenly it becomes indigestible. Okay. I've done a lot of work on this, actually. And I can tell you quite categorically that if you start to to change your feelings about what you eat, you will find yourself being able to tolerate foods that you didn't think that you could tolerate. I've done it myself. Okay. So what I see happening here in that central ring is it literally pushes the energy, the nutrition, the nutriment out. Now, Andrews call it the expression ring, the border of the collarette, is the area where, if you like, it's the barrier or the boundary between the digestive tract. We could say it stands in for the mucosa, for example, of the small intestine, with the tight junctions and the possibility of leaky gut, etc. When we have radial furrows that cross through it, we tend to think in terms of, they're spasm furrows, and they're about stress and holding stress in the digestion, but they're also about, in some systems of iridology, they describe a tendency to leaky gut. But if we think about the sort of flow of energy from the digestive region out into the rest, it works energetically and emotionally as well as physically. That's my point. So in other words, when you get an indentation of the collarette, which is where it sort of dips sharply in towards the pupil, or an expansion of the collarette where it bells out into a particular area, there's a communication happening there between the ring of nourishment in the middle, mediated by the humoral zone, the zone of harmonization and what have I called it? Harmonization and integration. And the immediately adjacent zone, so that we can then start to ask some questions about how the flow of nourishment is working into that particular zone, or are we contracting it? Are we starving it of nourishment, or are we flooding it with nourishment? Are we how do we move towards the energetic topic, if you like, or concern of the sector? I'm a little bit worried at this stage that I'm talking very technically here, and I might have left everybody behind. Please come back at me with something.
Fascinating. I wanted to just ask whether either of you have the image where you've superimposed the physical on top of these more energetic behavioral
I
areas.
haven't got
Is
that
that
as a
something I
slide.
can
That's in
pull
the
up?
book.
Yeah, I might be able to. I could try and find an example of
Oh,
that.
don't worry if it's hard. It just sounded
It'll just take
absolutely
me some time, that's
fascinating.
all. But basically, I think it's a good question, though, Gillian. Let me see
Would
if I
you say
can.
you're the first person to have done that in history, Peter, really? To have integrated the two?
We all stand on the shoulders of giants, let's face it.
Yeah.
I think that I have a debt of gratitude to voice here to Harry Wolff, because I don't remember that he ever actually did a graphic for us, but I think it was him who sort of originally proposed something very similar to this. And I think to some extent I have, I've been responsible for. I think I've been responsible for working with it all these years because this is not something I dreamed up when I was just thinking, oh, I'll write a book. What would be a good template to use? This was something that I've been working with for a couple of decades at least. And some of the things that are discussed in the book around specific positions, which also relate to behavioral and RAID systems, um, which are, reliable, which have reliable interpretations that you can start. Like the key to working with people is being able to verbalize what you're saying. An interpretation has to start with some kind of concept that you want to verbalize or express or articulate in some way. And so what I've tried to do is also give some of the language that's appropriate to each domain in order to sort of trigger those discussions and those interpretations. Um, and so, this chart and what I've done with it is the fruit of 20 or 30 years actually of development. So yeah, you could say I'm the first person, but I don't want to really get involved in that. This is an individual work. This is a unique work. It is my work, and I think I say somewhere at the beginning of it, I'm not aiming to be the ultimate expert in any of this. There are people who've done lots and lots and lots of work on this particular thing. This is my take on it. This is my offering, if you like, and it's not better or worse or more comprehensive or more truthful than anybody else's. It's just one way of expressing it.
Okay.
Don't know whether anybody else has further comments. I mean, do tell us a little bit more about where we can find out more about this, Peter. Where would you like us to purchase the book? And
Well, you can purchase it direct from Aon.
okay,
Or you can get it from my website as well. I have
could you just tell us your websites and perhaps we can
yes,
put it
it's
at
the
the
Natural
bottom of the.
Center, thenaturalcenter.com.
Okay, maybe we could put that into the study notes, Shahid.
Okay, yeah, sure. I'll
Thank
put it.
you.
Yeah, when we upload it on the YouTube, we can add that information.
Mm.
Great.
And
Okay.
do you have any other sort of teaching on it that the layperson can access, Peter, or would it be coming to courses of yours beyond
Well,
reading the book?
I think the courses would be. I have got a course coming. I've got a sort of introductory day coming up in. I think it's the 25th of January. I haven't
Oh,
put out the notices for it yet, which is terribly, terribly short now. But I think I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to try
well,
and
maybe
run
we
it.
could put those under this as well.
Yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
it'll be online on the 25th of January. I'll be sending, and people could just email me to find out about that. And this is going to be a very general introduction to what I've done here to introduce the energetic model, I guess.
Mm.
Um, and I've called it quantum because partly because I was looking for a word that everybody else has got. The behaviorals somebody's got integrated, somebody's got metaphysical, somebody's got, I was looking for something that hadn't already been taken. So I'm not too stuck on the quantum. I think it works actually. I do rationalize that and justify the use of the word quantum because I know a lot of poor physicists are going to be terribly upset about me appropriating their word. But actually, it's not their word. It existed before them, and it will exist after. But the quantum thing is there also because because it is about a different way of looking at energy. It's about non-local effects. It's about healing, which of course I think is a quantum activity. Actually, it's like almost like reversing reversing time, reversing the past to a time when you were healthy, if you like. Yeah. So there's all of that with it, but I think that the stories, if I'm going to sort of come out and say what makes the book for me when I read it is the stories, because I think that the illustrations using individual case histories, as Andrew said, there's quite a lot of, there are a couple of sort of expanded case histories, but each chapter, if you like, has a mini case history in it, an illustration from my own archives, really, that ably illustrate the material that I'm trying to present. And I've been told, I didn't even know this, but it seems second nature to me, but I have been told that my style in the classroom is very much that of a storyteller. Something I've always wanted to be. And I note, by the way, that Aon have actually started a fiction base, which I plan to be populating at some stage, because I actually think people learn a lot from stories. The stories stick in the head, yeah, and sometimes you can learn more effectively that way. And so I have tried to make a book that's readable. You will be the judge of that. The people I'm sitting looking at right now who have dipped into it. I don't know how readable you think it is.
I think, Oliver, you have been reading it, and you told us exactly that, didn't you?
Absolutely. So for me, I was actually waiting for a moment to actually talk. And it was really interesting because I really want to echo exactly what you've been saying so far, and especially now in the last minute or so. And it's really a storytelling. And it shows all the different levels that we may want to interpret iridology science, everything that we found in the iris. But it also goes deeper because, like you said earlier, about the nutrition aspect of when we look at some kind of dysfunction or anything, we might want to go down the route of saying, oh, this pathology, something is wrong there. When in fact, you are saying quite the opposite by saying in a philosophical way that there are many levels of interpretation. And it is our own understanding of that particular markings that actually is the key to portray that and kind of interpret it in a way that the person in front of us can understand. And the way that you're talking is actually not the way that I was expecting when first reading the book, because it's literally really philosophical, really explaining at the very various level of our understanding on what those signs and markings are actually telling us. And usually it's nothing to do so much with what the genetic makeup, which we find iridology was helpful for, but also for the nourishment, like you said, but also the emotionals and how we have different aspects of relationships with food, emotions, and everything else in between, and how everything is affecting us. And I really love the way that you explained the HPA axis and the art thyroid axis as well, and how they kind of combine together to restore balance in the body. And that is exactly what the body tries to do, is to restore harmony, to keep sure that it keeps homeostasis, so that is working as best as it can. And if it has to find shortcuts, then the body will find those shortcuts to make sure that it functions and makes it survives. So now for me, it's absolutely wonderful because now when we look at the iris, I'm not looking at the same way anymore. I'm looking at every single level where that markings may indicate something that is not so much of, let's say, a pathology or dysfunction, but rather how it affects the person and how the person affect that particular marking by reinforcing everything around it.
Well, that was wonderful. I think I should get you to write some copy for me, because I know that you do a lot of that. But I know, I think you got it. You got it. I am impressed, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Well, that was, perhaps we'll have a part 2 of this, Peter, after you've sort of introduced it to the world properly as of your first course on it. And the stories that you've just mentioned are definitely a sort of book 3, or maybe
Well,
even
actually, now
presenting
that
in a different
you're
way?
quite right, actually, just cutting in there for a moment, and my next iridology book, and I'm so far away from doing it because I've got another couple of titles to come before that can come, but my next iridology book will be a book of case studies and
Oh,
i.e.
really?
stories. Yeah.
Amazing. Oh, well, maybe we will. Well, I'm quite sure we will have another, interview with you come 2025. Perhaps you'll tell us a bit more about those books that are going to come in between as well.
Yeah, well, the next one is actually is hardcore naturopathy. It's called Natural Healing, and I was so
Okay.
pleased to get that title because I studied in John Christopher's School of Natural Healing, and he didn't call it the School of Herbology or the School of Herbal Healing. He called it the School of Natural Healing, and that's always been very important to me. And that book is a reworking of the sort of Galenic, and I think it works in Tib medicine too. Actually, the six non-naturals.
Yeah,
As they call
it is
them.
from Thib. It's actually from Greeks. So
Yeah.
originally, so basically, so this concept is actually Greek. So the six factors of illness, and I think I mean, it then went out to the Arabs, and then they developed it, and then came back to the Europeans. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a reworking of the concept or the doctrine of the six non-naturals for the 21st century.
Oh, fantastic.
I mean, I think that
Okay.
the idea of stories is always it has how Eastern teachers teach actually through stories, whether it's medicine, example. So I think your concept of stories, and I think what Olivier said, I think it's healing through all aspects of it: spiritual healing, emotional healing, and physical healing. So a lot of illnesses are probably emotional and spiritual. And I think what you said resonated with me earlier when you said something about you spoke to people, you had clients for 15 minutes, and what they liked is your voice, because your voice is very soothing. Your voice itself is actually a form of medicine. And because your voice it can actually calm people, and people, they come in, they're very anxious because
Yeah.
they've probably seen many people, and when they come to see you, they just because you exude this confidence of what obviously you know what you're talking about. It appears to the practitioner, sorry, the client. I think that in itself is a healing, and listening to people, actually having the ability to listen. So I mean,
Very important.
most of the time I spend in the year 3 of our students is get a psychotherapist to sit in and teach them to listen. So I think you basically hit the nail on the head there about, when you gave us the example about 15 minutes, you can spend 2 hours and people won't benefit. But
Exactly.
if they can feel that you know what you're talking about and you just listen to them, basically.
Thank you for that. I mean, yes, I like to think I know what I'm talking about. Sometimes I sort of sit there and think, do I? But we all have our moments. But you're absolutely right. And again, a good accolade. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Well, this was a marvelous, I think, beginning to a sort of new set of recordings, videos that we'll have for the GNC.
Absolutely.
And thank you so much. I very, very much look forward to future ones, and I'm sure with you, Andrew, as well, in the course of 2025. And with you, Shahid, you've written books too.
Yes,
And
I think
Olivier,
both of us.
Olivier, you're also an author, aren't you?
Yes.
Absolutely,
So we
yes.
have an absolute wealth of videos ahead, I would say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we should turn it into an ongoing discussion.
Absolutely.
It's good.
Oh, good.
Right?
Well,
I think
thank you so much. Shahid, maybe you'd like to just say a few words to
I
sort
think
of
I think
close
you're the host. I think maybe you want to wrap it up.
well, just to say then, very, very happy season, whenever that is, whether you're watching this before the festive season ahead or afterwards. And this will be a marvelous gift for anyone at any time of the year. And hopefully lots and lots of people will study this deeply and then perhaps come to your courses if they aren't already students of yours, Peter, because you've given everyone a huge appetite for this, I would say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gillian.
Thank you.
Thank you.